Chapter 1. 'Twas a brisk wind that found us on our way to Darmir's home for the evening of the tale that I recount. A winter storm came upon our township 2 days earlier, bringing light snowfall and a devilish wind that cut through even the many layers of fur I wrapped around myself. As my friend Rickard walked beside me, his shivers informed me he felt the same. With such a wind, few ventured out to brave the cold. Of our daring band that made up Darmir's audience, only Hector and my dearest Christine were absent. Hector was home, much to our delight, still recovering from that horse kick. Christine was away with her parents, visiting a nearby shire 4 days' ride from us. I promised upon her return I would retell whatever tale Darmir gave. Much to my joy, she leaned close and whispered in my ear that she would look forward to a private and personal telling of the tale. The smoke rising from Darmir's chimney promised a blazing fire and warm sanctuary from the cold. As we walked through the oak door, warmth welcomed us like a lost friend, along with the aroma of some type of soup Darmir had waiting. Once inside, my friends and I filled our stomachs with what Darmir called clothen stew, a spicy, thick soup that warmed us by more than just the cooked heat. It was quite delicious. We settled down before the heat of logs burning in the fireplace. Darmir insulated himself with a cloak of rich gray fur before settling in his creaking chair and placing a tankard of ale upon the table beside him. He smiled at us and asked, "What tale would you like to hear?" Without Christine, I thought he would abstain from recounting a tale about Aleph and Marist, and I was right. "I don't care what tale you tell," Janya said, "as long as it's not about vampires." Jan nudged me. He told me his sister was still slightly bothered about the previous tale, and she slept uneasily since. I, too, still had such thoughts in the back of my own mind. It was unsettling to think of the vampire Brookstone slowly going insane from being helpless in that cave for eternity. We sat and thought for a moment before Rickard chose the subject of the tale. As a student of the cleric arts, he asked for more information about the doppelgangers mentioned earlier. Are doppelgangers common? How can you detect one if they have shape-shifted? How long can they maintain that shape? His questions probably would have filled the night had not Darmir raised his hand to stop him. The old man leaned back in his chair, shifting deeply into his warm furs. "Young Rickard, you may have more questions concerning these creatures than I can answer. Not many have studied them as they prey on humans. I do, however, know some enlightening tales about them. I heard that a doppelganger once ruled a kingdom to the north many years ago, passing itself off as its king whom it had killed," Kalar said. "The king's true nature was not known until it was caught killing a castle servant." We turned toward him as he spoke. Since his first visit he had become slightly more outspoken, but he did not seem the type who would recount what sounded like a peasant's tale. Darmir raised an eyebrow. "Quite true, young sir. 'Twas Lord Colin of which you speak. It was a full 5 luna before the truth was discovered." "Surely that can't be true, Darmir," Jan said. "I could understand how such a creature may pass as an unimportant servant, but as a lord of the land?" "'Twas quite true. In fact, the doppelganger ruled quite well, I'm told. One must understand that doppelgangers, while not human, are not unintelligent." He thought for a moment. "I know a perfect tale that will explain some of the traits of doppelgangers for you. I know the truth of the story from a mage who knew the people involved in the tale." Thus began the tale of the doppelganger. Chapter 2. The story begins in a land only 2 lunas ride from here in the township known as Mount Bretai, which was, and still is, well known for the lumber it exports to other townships. Along the west side and creeping down the south are the mounts of Bretai, from whence the town gains its name. The mounts are only a quarter mile high and have a gentle slope making them look like nothing more than huge rocky hills. The best lumber grows on those mounts. The forests are mostly blackwood, oak, and vinwood, but scattered about are some of the more sought-after rare trees, such as ironwood and heartwood. The mounts also contain a few shallow caverns that provide shelter from the sudden storms, but not much else. Throughout the mounts and forests are small, slow streams that drain into small lakes from which many creatures and lumbermen gain their drinking water. The rest of the land is woodland and pasture. Mount Bretai is also well known for the peaceful life it offers its inhabitants. The weather, unlike tonight, is nearly always warm and comfortable. No dangerous beasts stalk either the woods or the town, such having been killed years earlier. The largest animal in Mount Bretai would be the cattle that gaze steadily in the pastures. The life of any resident of Mount Bretai can be fairly easy. Anyone is able to raise cattle or chop trees and carry lumber, make a comfortable living in and around the mount. It was so with a man named Zach Ciron. Zach was advancing in age, having seen 38 seasons pass. His dark brown hair was flecked with gray, but he still had the muscles and strength of a younger man, and there was fire in his eyes from his sharp mind. Though not known as a jovial man, he was even-tempered and well-mannered. It is said when he felt an emotion about something, he felt it with all his soul, whether it be like or dislike, and he was not afraid to let others know his point of view. His work was likewise dedicated. If Zach Ciron began a job, he gave it his all until he was finished, and to his own satisfaction at having done it well. Zach did many things in life, from fishing the nearby rivers to a farmer's hard existence, yet in all of them he was an honest man and a hard worker. In his older years he sought a profession that would allow him to collect enough wealth so he could enjoy the years in which he would not be able to work. Upon his quest to find such work, he chanced to hear of the fortunes possible in Mount Bretai. He wasted little time moving to the land surrounding the mounts and building a modest log home. From that small home he went into the surrounding wood to harvest the finest trees for lumber. In 2 seasons' time he had become known for bringing in the best lumber in the land. While other lumbermen cut any tree they deemed good enough to sell, Zach cut only the straightest, which were not old enough to lose their richness, but were not so young as to be of little value. Another difference was, for every tree he cut, he planted a sapling or seed in its place, so he conserved the forest resources for the future. He became well off, wealthy enough to slow his harvest and enjoy the more social side of life. In the winter of that second season, he met the woman he would call his wife. Celia Grittin was the daughter of one of the millwrights who worked outside Mount Bretai. At only 18, she was much younger than he, but she did not have the foolishness that women of her age often showed. One would have thought that the difference in age would matter to her, but upon knowing the kindness of Zach's heart and soul, she cared nothing for the difference in ages. She was fair-haired and bright-faced, with blue eyes that sparkled like sapphires in the sunlight. Darmir motioned toward Jania. Out of manners to having a lady present, I shan't go into her other physical details. Her eyes brightened and her cheeks flushed. Suffice it to say, she was quite comely in appearance. Jania giggled and gently struck Fristel's shoulder. Although I had not seen what he did to earn such a response, I gathered it was not totally undeserved. Knowing Fristel as I did, he had, through speech or action, teased Jania somehow. Her action was not tempered with anger or annoyance, but rather with, well, I would not think that of those two, though I knew stranger things occurred. Darmir smiled and nodded before continuing. In the 3rd year of his life in Mount Bretai, Zach made Celia his wife. They moved into his log home and enjoyed many months in each other's company. It is well known they were deeply in love. Perhaps their strong devotion was because he was her first serious love, and Zach never had time to enjoy that emotion either. Whatever the case, the two learned about love from each other and with each other. Because of his wealth and having built his home, they wanted for nothing save being with each other. One would have expected them to live happily together for a long time. In fact, they lived happily together. But sadly, 'twas not for that long. One spring day, Zack went into the wood to scout for new timber, taking an axe and his short bow. Celia remained behind, as always, for her husband thought it was not right to take her on such long journeys through the wild wood. After kissing her lightly, he said he would be gone for a short time. It was nearly half a day's walk through the green forest before Zack prepared to return home. As he went back, he heard a faint cry of someone lost in the woods. Though he called back many times, he could not get any response other than that of a young boy or woman crying fitfully some distance away. Resigned to the fact of having to locate the source of the sound instead of its coming to him, he moved deeper into the forest. He came near one of the shallow caverns in the mounts of Britai and realized the sound came from within. He called out again for the hidden person to come out, saying all was safe. Though the crying became calmer and quieter, there was no other response. Fearing the person was hurt or so hysterical that he or she was not able to understand Zack's offer to help, he stepped into the dark opening. As he did, the crying stopped, followed by a few moments later by a yell of surprise and pain. Moments later, a cloaked figure left the cavern. Some time later, Zack exited too, but it was not the same Zack who entered earlier. Much later that night, Celia welcomed her tired husband home. He returned her hug and kiss as usual, sitting down before the small fire she made to recount what he had seen during the day. As always, she was attentive, listening to his tales of large blackwood trees and the many forest animals he saw. "Are you very hungry?" she asked once he finished, motioning to a small pot beside the fire. Zack shook his head. "I shot a quicket for my midday sup. I'm too tired for dinner now, though the stew smells inviting." She nodded. Her husband usually ate a heavy meal when he returned, but abstinence was not unusual enough to cause concern. Neither was his insistence on going to bed, though the evening was still young. She thought at first he went to bed so she could join him for love, but that was not the case. Zack kindly refused her offer of romance, saying he was truly tired and wanted only to rest. Seeing the disappointment on her face, he quickly added that he would welcome her warmth beside him. With lighter thoughts, she disrobed and lay beside him under the fine quilt she made months earlier. As her bare body touched his, she felt his skin was cool, and put her hand on his forehead. "Are you well, my husband?" she asked. "You're cool to the touch." Zack smiled at her touch, but then shook his head. Realizing that was not a sufficient response, he nuzzled her wrist and said reassuringly, "I'm just tired, my love. Think nothing of it." She kissed him lightly and draped an arm across his chest. "Still, there's something bothering you, isn't there?" she asked in concern. Even after he chopped wood all day, she never knew him to be so tired to turn down a passionate night. He gently stroked the long blonde hair that splayed across her chest, his eyes gazing into the blue depths of hers. "I just wish that we spent more time together. It's not fair to you that we're together only in the evenings and mornings of our lives." Deep love and devotion showed in Celia's eyes. "This is why I love him so," she thought, moving closer with a contented smile. "I could ask no more of you than what I have. We're together at the important times, and that's enough." "No, it's not," he smiled and kissed her. "Starting tomorrow, that will change." "How so, my husband?" She slid one bare leg over his. Zack gently moved her atop him. "When next I go into the forest, I'll take you with me. Then you can see for yourself what I tell you. Nor shall I leave every day to work in the woods." He looked deep into her eyes. "Some days I'll stay here with you." "Just what makes you so concerned about our being together?" she asked, kissing him with rising passion. He raised his eyebrow and spoke softly into her ear. Can a husband not show his love for a wife without suspicion? Perhaps you think I feel guilty for dancing about with wood nymphs and have decided to take you with me instead." She laughed. "I can't speak for other women, but for myself, I know I have no worry about you dancing with any nymphs, real or not." They spent the remainder of the night loving each other with a passion and energy that matched their marriage night. That is not to say they did not love with such passion only those 2 times, but that night was particularly passionate. The afterglow of their lovemaking removed any concern that Celia had about her husband's odd behavior. "Then a doppelganger can undergo even extreme scrutiny by those who knew him well, and still remain undetected?" Ricard asked. "Apparently so," Jania said. "If a wife can't tell any difference at such an intimate time, who could?" "Aleph did, when Brookstone sent one after him," Fristel said. "Ah, you spring ahead of my tale, my young friends," Darmer said, looking at Fristel. "You must remember that particular doppelganger did not consume Marist's intelligence and memory. It took only her form. Besides, this creature has not been totally undetected," Kalar added. "The woman is too blinded by her emotions to realize that something is amiss," he added quietly, "as usual." "You mean the cool skin and lack of hunger?" I asked, ignoring his last remark. "Such things are not so rare as to call attention to someone." Darmer looked at me. "Even so, Kalar is right in his assessment. It's my understanding that such minor changes in behavior or body are the only signs of detection in a fully shape-shifted doppelganger. It is a fact that most people overlook such seemingly unimportant changes, which is what allows the doppelganger to be so successful." "By using the information from your story so far," Rickard said, "one must assume that doppelgangers have a lower body temperature than humans, and either don't or can't eat our foods." He seemed in a studious mood. Darmer nodded at the comment. "The body temperature is, indeed, a few degrees lower, but only enough to produce a cool feeling to the skin. As for their diet, you will learn more as the story unfolds." Chapter 3. For more than a fortnight, Zack Saran made good on his promise. He went into the forest only 3 days a week, taking Celia with him each time. For her part, she loved the time she spent with her husband in the forest and at home. His passion for her seemed to have found new fire that overwhelmed her concerns about some of the changes in his behavior. He insisted now on taking a nightly stroll alone, returning an hour later, and feeling more energetic than when he left. Such was not totally out of place, but there was more. He ate very little during that fortnight, no matter what Celia prepared, yet he lost no weight and did not become sickly or weak from his poor diet. There was also the strange behavior of the farm animals they passed on their trips to Mount Bretai for goods and to sell lumber. Cattle and horses shied from Zack, as did smaller animals. Dogs and cats moved away with their tails lowered as if they feared him. Celia considered discussing some of those occurrences with Lyatris, the town cleric, but such thoughts rapidly left her mind. Since she was a child, she feared the dark-robed man, partly because of his fanatical moods, and partly because she never liked his speeches about what he considered evil behavior. During one such private talk he had with her, she came to distrust him completely. When she had turned 12, Leatrice talked with her about the evils of how she may begin to feel toward men, and them toward her. All during the time his eyes roved over her body like a hungry animal sizing up a meal. Such a look unnerved her, but when he placed his hand on her bodice, firmly touching her breast, she struck him and ran out crying. She never told anyone of those events, and never sought his counsel again. Celia did her best to forget that vile act, and the equally despicable man who did it. After she and Zack exchanged vows, she noticed Leatrice's face in the crowd of those gathered and saw hate in his eyes as he looked at her and her new husband. With Zack's renewed affection and devotion to her happiness, she dismissed the things that seemed odd. After another 2 weeks, however, the situation changed. The first person to find the new problem was Barton, the rancher. He was young, he cut lumber, but later he chose the less physically demanding job of raising a small herd of cattle and goats for cheese. As was his custom, Barton went to the barn in the early morning before the sun rose to milk the cows and goats before turning them out to pasture for the day. As he opened the barn door that day, the scent of death struck him. To his rage and nausea, his favorite cow lay dead before him, slaughtered and torn apart. No one in Mount Brita had ever lost a cow to a predator before that day. There she was, killed by some creature in the night, and not just from one bite or claw wound. Her throat had been savagely torn open. Word quickly spread. Aquila Athene, the city master, went to Barton's ranch. It was rare for a city master to be a woman, but she was well respected for her knowledge of many things. Upon examining the cow, she announced to the gathered ranchers and curious townfolk that she had no idea what manner of beast did the killing. She had seen many animal attacks in the distant lands from whence she came, but never anything like that. Despite the fact that saber-toothed cats lived in the mountains far to the north, and occasionally killed a farm animal in other shires, there were always other wounds on the dead animals, not just a torn throat. Claw wounds and large tracks always marked the kill site. There were none in this present case. In addition, had such a beast killed one animal, it surely would have attacked others. One of the ranchers mentioned another part of the mystery. If the barn was closed for the night, how could any beast get in to kill a cow? Though the barn was made of planks, with spaces between them for light and air to pass, there was no opening other than the door large enough for anything bigger than a mouse to enter. Had the mysterious predator opened the door and closed it when finished? Leatrius had his own answer. He said it was not an animal but an evil demon haunting the township, and that people must repent their evil ways before the demon came for them, and not their animals. None believed him or his ravings about demons and evil spirits, nor did they notice the look of contempt on his countenance when they scorned his ideals. The slaughter of another cow shook the community 2 nights later. That cow died the same way, its throat ripped out without any other injuries or signs of feeding. Leatrius continued expounding his theory, but few listened, thinking evil demons were nothing but superstitious nonsense. The culprit had to be an animal that wandered into the area and simply must be hunted down and destroyed. A massive hunt was launched. Zach volunteered his knowledge of the forested areas to help track the mysterious predator. Despite a lengthy search, no tracks or evidence of the creature was found after 2 days spent investigating the mounts and crevices of Mount Britae. When the search failed, the ranchers set traps for the creature, including posting sentries. The killings continued for another lunicycle, without any sign of who or what performed the bloody deeds. 5 more cattle, 2 horses, and 3 goats all died with open throats. Even when one horse was killed inside its stall, while a lookout sat on the stable roof, nothing out of the ordinary was seen or heard. No trap was sprung, and no sentry spotted anything. As lack and fear of progress increased, people began to believe Leatrius after all. With increasing support, he decided to resolve the situation when no one else could. On a cool, clear night, he called for the concerned townsfolk to gather for a nightly prayer to exorcise the murderous demon dwelling in their town. The exorcism would be held at the spot where the demon killed a horse the previous evening. Nearly the entire population of Mount Britae was there, including Zach and Celia. Leatrius filled the night air with chants, prayers, fire, and blessed water. The crowd watched silently, though some men voiced their disbelief in the possible success of the fanatic levels the exorcism reached at times, though they spoke such words quietly. A few left early after hearing Leatrius' fanatic ravings, while others left due to the cold. Zach and Celia left because of both. Still, despite what anyone thought of Leatrius' exorcism, no animals died that night or the next. 5 days passed when Celia's father, Heath Grattan, visited the couple in their home. To his distress, he found Celia in bed with a pale face, her eyes closed and a wet rag on her forehead. Zack sat on the edge of the bed beside her, gently wiping beads of sweat from her cheeks and bare chest. "What's wrong?" Heath asked, shutting the door and walking quickly to the bed. His daughter's pallid skin caused him great concern. "She's been in a fever for 4 days. I think she caught the sickness when we attended Leatrice's gathering," Zack said, exhausted. Heath touched Celia's cool forehead with his palm. It was cold that night. Some of the others caught a fever from it too. He looked at Zack's haggard expression. "Why didn't you send word she was sick? I would have come as soon as I heard." He leaned back in a chair. "I've been with her every moment since she became ill. I did not want to leave her alone. It was just this morning that the fever broke." The wary man looked at his wife's pale face and nodded when he put his palm against her forehead. "I think the fever is finally leaving." Heath nodded and studied Zack's face intently. He seemed weak and pale too. He placed a hand on Zack's shoulder. "Do you have the fever?" he asked in concern. "Or is it that you haven't slept since she became ill?" Zack managed to smile. "I must look terrible. I have not eaten or slept much since she became sick. I needed to go to Mount Bretai for basic supplies 2 days ago, but I didn't dare leave." "I'll stay with her if you want to go to town." Heath removed his hand from Zack's shoulder and nodded. "You need a break anyway." Zack stood slowly and looked at Celia in concern. "Are you sure you don't mind?" he asked softly. "Zack, I was taking care of her long before you came and stole her away from me. Go on, I'll take care of her until you're back." Zack nodded. He gathered his money pouch and opened the door with a soft sound made him turn. Celia sat up in bed, her red eyes partially open. Zack ran back to gently take her hand, relief showing on his face. "How do you feel?" he asked gently, brushing her cheek. A weak smile came to her face. She nodded to show she was all right. "Just tired and a bit cold." He pulled the quilt to her neck and smiled, as did her father. Heath nodded to him and said, "Go to town and get your supplies. Everything will be fine until you return." Zack looked into his wife's half-closed eyes. "I have to get supplies. I'll be back as soon as I can." Celia smiled weakly again. "I won't go anywhere without you, husband." Returning the smile, he kissed her head lightly. "I'll be back soon." Heath met him at the door and said, "Watch yourself when you're in town, Zack. Ever since Leatrice did that exorcism and stopped the attacks, he set himself up like a king." Zack frowned at that. "The animal killings have stopped?" Heath nodded. "Yes," he said grimly. "There hasn't been one since the exorcism. Of course, Leatrice takes full credit for stopping the evil demon, if there was even one. He's been collecting donations from the town ever since. Even Aquile has been giving him tribute for his miracle." Zack shook his head in disgust at the thought of the cleric taking tribute for something he had no right to take credit for. "He will get nothing from me in the way of tribute." Under his breath he added softly, "though he just might get something else." As the door closed, Heath looked down at his daughter with a fatherly smile. "That's a good man you married, daughter." She nodded. "I could not wish for a more loving husband. When I was sick, I sometimes awoke for a few moments to see him sitting beside me, always awake. No matter when it was, he was there, caring for me." Heath smiled in understanding. "Count yourself lucky to have such a man so deeply in love with you, Celia. Not many men these days have such devotion." "I always do, Father." "Now comes the trouble," Jan said. We turned to look at him, but it was Fristel who asked, "Why do you think that?" Jan frowned, as if he were the only one who could see how the story would end. "Don't you see what will happen? The cleric will demand tribute from Siron. He will refuse, and Leatrice will notice there hasn't been any more killings since Zack stayed at home. He'll tell the townspeople, and they will burn him at the stake for witchcraft." He smiled at his ability to solve the story, before Darmir finished and looked at him expectantly for his reply. Darmir smiled as broadly as Jan, but he shook his head. To presume something of which you know little about always invites disaster. Jan's smile faded as Darmir continued his tale. Some time passed before Zack returned home with a sack containing flour, eggs, smoked meat, cheese, and a few vegetables. He looked at Celia, who felt well enough to rise from bed, sat bundled up in her rocking chair before a low fire. Her eyes and smile welcomed his arrival, as did her heart. "I bought the makings of stew," he said. When he looked at his father, he added, "Although I can't work the miracles of cooking that Celia can, will you stay and sup with us, Heath?" "Gladly," he smiled. Zack nodded and prepared stew, while father and daughter talked quietly. Half an hour later, the three sat down to eat. Heath ate a fine meal of stew, hard bread, cheese, and wine. Celia, whose hunger had not yet returned, ate only a little, as did Zack, eating only a small amount of bread soaked with stew. "I should think you would be stuffing yourself with food," Heath said. "I'm not too hungry," he said. "To be honest, I ate a meat pastry in town. Since Celia is well, I'm too happy to eat much." Heath was not satisfied with that answer, remembering Celia's tale of Zack's lost appetite over recent weeks. Before he could pursue the matter, a shout from outside caught their attention. "Zack Suron! Come out and give yourself up!" Both men jumped to their feet and moved toward the door. Zack opened it enough to see Leatrice in front of several angry townspeople armed with long-handled axes, pitchforks, and burning torches. "What's the meaning of this?" Zack demanded from behind the partially closed door. Leatrice took a step closer to the home. "Trent, the rancher, saw you leaving his barn a few hours ago. When he went to see what you were doing, he found one of his cattle dead, its throat ripped out like all the others." Angry cheers rose from the crowd. Leatrice let them vent their hatred for a moment. Then he quieted them. "Give yourself up, or we'll burn you out of your home." Zack slammed the door shut and sat at the dinner table, his expression confused. "Is what they say true?" Heath asked, standing near the door. He did not answer and glanced at Celia's worried face before nodding. "I could not help it. I'd been too long without food." Fearful tears spilled from Celia's eyes, but Heath remained grim, stepping closer to protect her and focusing a hard stare on Zack. "What do you mean? You just brought food." Zack shook his head. "None that I can eat." He looked at Celia's tear-filled eyes and shook his head sadly. I'm sorry, Celia. I'd hoped you would never find out about this. I love you and never wanted you to know." She choked back tears. "Then you killed the other animals too? Why?" "No, I did not kill them all. The cow I killed today was only the third. What happened to the rest, I don't know. I don't need a full meal except once every fortnight." Heath moved away from his daughter to stand across the table from Zack, his hand on his dagger hilt. "Regardless of how many you have or have not killed, why do you need raw meat?" "Not the meat, Heath, the blood." He lowered his head in shame. "I'm not what I appear to be." "Then who or what are you?" Celia stood slowly from the chair, unable to believe what he said, though she knew it was true. "Your race calls my kind dopplegangers." Heath's hand formed a fist. He had never seen one of the foul creatures before then, but he knew what they were. "You killed the real Zack, didn't you?" he demanded bitterly. "You took his place. Why? To live his life?" Zack half nodded. "You could say that, but it was not I who murdered him." Chapter 4. The two humans wore angry, confused expressions. "Yet you have his form," Heath said. "From what I understand, your race can do so only by killing the person you take the shape from." "My race can take the shape of those they kill. That's true. On some occasions we can take the form of those we study diligently. It's also true that some of my people feed on yours, as you do on the cattle you raise. He tipped his head slightly in admission. Others of us, myself included, do not believe it is proper to feed on other intelligent beings. Those, like me, feed on the blood of lower animals, such as cattle and other wild beasts. Liar! You have Zack's form! He tried to remain calm. Please wait and hear me out. The restless crowd outside knew who had been killing their animals, and they wanted blood in revenge. They no longer cared who was responsible. Such was the angry fervor that Leatrice inspired. The only thing that kept him from burning the home right away was their concern for Heath and Celia's safety. Leatrice was being prodded to go inside and talk to Zack. The others hoped he could use his exorcism skills to free Zack from whatever evil controlled him, as he was once a respected man. At the least, the cleric might free the two inside so the house could be torched. Leatrice was hesitant about the suggestion, but he had little choice. His new claim in being the one responsible for solving the animal killings and taking tribute left him no recourse. A loud knock on the door made the three inside turn, though Heath kept an eye on Zack. The oak door slowly creaked open, and Leatrice cautiously peered in. "Come in, Leatrice," Heath said firmly. "It seems you were right about evil being loose in our town. I never suspected it would be so close by." That gave Leatrice renewed bravery, and he stepped in to cautiously close the door behind him. He smiled weakly and said, "It does appear so." Zack frowned in disgust. "You would be one to speak of evil, Leatrice." "Be silent, evil one!" Leatrice demanded. "I shall not." He turned to Celia and Heath. "I had been in the forest around here for some time, living off forest creatures and staying far from humans, so I may live in peace. It was not long ago I saw Zack scouting the forest for timber." His eyes shifted toward the cleric. "Although I had seen humans before, I had never actually met one, since our actual appearance is somewhat unpleasant to your kind." "What kind of evil creature are you?" Leatrice asked with hate-filled eyes, stepping nearer to the two humans. "Some forest demon come to kill hapless farmers?" Zack looked at him with wrath in his eyes. "I am not as evil as some others who pretend to be, other than they are for their own desires. I shall finish my tale, and then let us see who is truly evil." Leatrice walked closer to Heath. "Don't listen to his evil, lest he lull you into a spell of control." "No," Celia said. "I want to know what happened to my husband." Zack nodded and turned to face her, keeping a wary eye on the cleric, who suddenly seemed worried. "Then listen. I started to watch your husband for several days out of curiosity. Several weeks ago I heard a crying sound coming from one of the caverns in a nearby mountain, and went to see the source. Your husband, who was closer, also heard and went to investigate." Leatrice grabbed a knife from the table and thrust it at Zack. "Die, foul creature! I'll not have you cast spells of confusion on these two." With a quick thrust, the blade flashed forward, but the knife-wielding hand stopped halfway to Zack's chest, held in Heath's strong grip. His face had an equally firm expression. "What evil spell has he cast on you?" the cleric, almost in panic, demanded. He could not free himself from the man's powerful hand. "Why do you want to stop his explanation?" Heath asked. "He's been here with my daughter for 2 luna without harming her. He took care of her when she was too sick and weak to defend herself, had he wanted to do evil. If for that and nothing else, I owe it for him to finish." The doppleganger smiled and gave Heath a curt nod. "'Tis the truth he fears to hear, Heath. When Zack Suron went inside that cave, I heard him scream in pain. I prepared to go in and find out what was wrong when his murderer stepped out. Uncertain of what to do, I waited until he left before I went in." "You found Zack dead?" Celia asked weakly, her cheeks wet with tears. "No, he was not dead yet. He was mortally wounded, and there was nothing I could do for him. You would have been proud of the way he faced his death, the doppelganger told her softly. He had no fear of death, only sorrow for leaving you. When I came to him, he showed no fear of me, even though he knew what I was. He begged me to avenge his death and do what I could for you, Celia. His love for you was very deep. Never have I felt such strong emotion. Enough of this! Leatrice fought to free his hand. This demon has you under his spell. Heath clenched his fist until Leatrice winced in pain. Cleric, the way you're acting, I think you have something to hide. He looked at Zack and nodded. Continue with your tale. Zack made sure the cleric was firmly held before continuing. To carry out what Zack requested of me, I had to take his form and memories. Since he knew he was dying, he agreed to what was required for me to do. He turned fully to Celia. I had never taken the life of a human or other intelligent being until that moment. I would not have done so then had I not wanted to honor his dying request. His emotional need was so strong it nearly overwhelmed me. You must believe me, Celia. I do, she said quietly, her sobs easing as reason took over. For some reason, I believe you. I'm glad, because when I took Zack's form, I also took his memory and feelings. His great love for you was disturbing at first. My kind do not have such strong emotions, and it overwhelmed me. Yet when I saw you the first time, I could not help loving you as he did. Evil has tainted this home and all who dwell within it, Leatrice said. I'll have it burned down with that demon in it. You two can still be saved if you free me now. Heath's anger shifted from the doppelganger to the cleric. What do you fear about this talk, cleric? What do you know of all of this? It is not I who was caught killing cattle, Heath Guyton, but that foul creature before you. It is he you should bar, not me. Wait, Celia said. He said he killed only 3 animals. Zack nodded. True. My kind cannot subsist on cooked food or ingest liquids like wine. We can consume only a very little of your foods without harm. Our digestive systems are designed for strictly a diet of blood and some raw meat. He looked at Celia. At first, I survived on the forest animals I found around the home. After I hunted them out, I needed other sources of food. That's why you went for walks at night? He nodded. After I fed on the first cow, I needed no more for 5 days. Then, when I heard more animals had been killed in the same fashion, I became suspicious. Heath's attention went to the cleric. Just what do you know about these killings that we don't? I know not of what you speak, he said, struggling to free himself. Let me go. Celia walked closer to the table, and the 3 men without fear of the one who called himself Zack Siron. She maintained distance between herself and the cleric, though. You were never caught until today? She asked the doppelganger. No, I was always very careful about being seen. With you being sick, and my staying with you, I wasn't able to eat. He shook his head as if ashamed to admit what he was about to say. Unfortunately, when one of my race becomes hungry, he often loses his caution. Some become mad with hunger, lose control of their behavior, and become little better than crazed animals. But I was here. You could have killed me for food. He looked into her blue eyes and wished he could take her hand. Fighting back the desire, he said gently, though it was to absorb memories of Zack at first, I came to love you as much as he. I would rather die than harm you. Leatrice! Someone shouted from outside. What goes there? You had best go, Heath, the doppelganger said. You and Celia. They won't listen to reason. Their lust for vengeance has put them beyond that. They will kill me if I sit outside. There must be some way. Celia moved closer to Zack, though she stopped short of being close to him. Don't defend this evil creature, woman, Leatrice said in fear. Let's go and leave him for his punishment. Heath drew the cleric to the table, thinking over the story he had just heard. Something was being left out. He looked at Leatrice with a steady gaze. Tell them we will come out in a few minutes. Leatrice stared. He thought to make a bolt for the door, but wisely decided against it. He turned toward the closed door and shouted, Everything is well. We'll be out soon. Who killed Zack, if it was not you? Celia asked. Doppelganger paused. I should think it's the same one who's been killing the other animals. I imagine you can guess who it is yourself. She turned to the cleric, the truth suddenly coming to her mind. You killed my husband. Leatrice's face turned ashen. A nervous twitch made his cheek quiver. You believe the stories of this evil creature? I do, he said softly. That's why you wanted to kill him before he could tell us. What I want to hear from you, cleric, is why. Celia fought back red-hot anger and pointed at him. Because he lusts for me. Heath and Zack stared at the cleric, fully expecting him to argue his innocence. Surprisingly, he did not. Yes, I killed Zack Zuron in that cave. I killed the other animals. He had a sly smile as he glared at the doppelganger. I knew you weren't really Zuron. You couldn't be. I killed him. After you killed the first animal, I knew what you were. So I killed the others and waited until you were caught. But he never was, Heath said angrily. No, he was not, Leatrice said with bitter anger. So I intended to make sure he would be caught. I was going to do that during the exorcism. He looked accusingly at the man. But you left. The animal killing stopped, and I was given tribute. Something I hadn't planned on, though it was welcome nonetheless. His face shone with fanatical greed. With my newfound wealth, and you not around, I decided to save the problem for a later time, which is now. They were so shocked by the cleric's blunt admission, they did not catch his threatening tone or the half-hidden promise. What now? Celia asked her father. Zack, she did not know what to call the shapeshifter, but she said, doesn't deserve what they have in store. With a flushed face, she turned toward Leatrice. You, however, do. The only thing for the two of you is to leave me here, Zack said, stepping toward the cleric. As for this one, he can keep me company. He glared at the man. Leatrice panicked, but said defiantly, You would not dare. Don't count on it, Heath said. Still, Celia's right, Zack. The doppelganger looked at him with raised eyebrows. Heath nodded, showing he intended to use the man's name. I won't turn you over to them to be killed for his evil. Regardless of what you really are, you've come to be someone I respect. I thank you for that, Heath, he said gratefully, but I fail to see any other way. Then I shall give you one, Leatrice announced calmly. If Celia agrees to become my wife, I will make sure you escape with your life. Never, the men said simultaneously. I would rather die with my husband. She clasped her hands on Zack's arm. I'll never let your filthy hands touch me again. Heath stepped toward the cleric with renewed hatred. Again? What do you mean, again? Leatrice shot an angry look at Celia and shoved Heath hard. He fell back against the heavy table along the wall. Tools were knocked loose from the resting spots on the wall as Heath fell to the floor, slumped and unmoving. Leatrice rushed for the door, but Zack was faster. He blocked away and stared intently at the cleric. Leatrice turned away from the doppelganger's hot gaze to face Celia. You've lain with this obscene creature of evil and become tainted yourself. I see that now. I no longer want your impure, unclean body next to mine. Celia's anger overcame her judgment, and she attacked the cleric. He charged toward her, too, hoping to hold her and force Zack to let him go free. He had not expected her to charge him, or for a strong hand to reach from behind to hold onto his wrist. When Leatrice spun, he stared into the doppelganger's angry eyes. "You won't touch my wife, murderer!" Leatrice's hand moved toward the dining table, where he dropped his knife. There was no time for him to grasp it. Zack, seeing what the cleric attempted, threw him on top of the same table Heath had struck. The cleric made a pained gasp as he landed. With a frail attempt to reach behind his back, he stepped forward, then fell face down. The handle of a small wood axe protruded from the center of his back, the metal head buried in his robes. Celia ran into Zack's arms as he stared down at the reddening axe head and slumped form of the dying cleric. His face showed blank shock as he realized what he had done. I did not intend to kill him." "Just as well you did, son." Heath stood painfully from the floor. "I would have if you hadn't. The question is, what do we do with you?" "I fulfilled Zack Sauron's last request," he told Celia. "Though I may love you a great deal, I can't risk your life by staying with you, even should you still want me." Celia looked up at him and slowly nodded. With tears in her eyes, she turned to her father. "Isn't there something, anything we can do?" "I don't rightly know. If Zack shows his face out that door, he's a dead man." He studied the dead cleric. "There may be a way." Some of the men outside were becoming anxious at the lack of news from the house. 2 were impatient enough to walk toward the door to find out what was going on. They stopped as the door slowly creaked open. Celia and her father stepped out with Leatrice behind them. Each man looked grim while Celia wept in her father's arms. One of the men stepped toward the cleric. "What went on in there?" Leatrice shook his head. "Evil has come and must now be destroyed." He looked at the men with the torches. "Burn down the house and the evil creature that lives inside." The men cheered and tossed their burning torches onto the sod roof. Soon the crowd watched in silence as fire caught in the dry sod. Flames slowly reached the roof timbers before finally engulfing the house and reducing it to smoldering embers. "What happened in there, Leatrice?" a man asked, watching smoke trail upward in a gray ribbon. "I can't say." He looked at the house behind him. "I only hope such evil never again comes to our land. For now, I must take this poor woman and her father to his home. Afterward, I will leave Mount Bretai. It is my calling to destroy such evil, and there is much of it to be exercised in other lands." The man nodded in awed silence as Leatrice guided Celia and Heath away from the smoldering house. Once out of earshot, Celia asked Leatrice, "Must you leave?" He gave a solemn nod. "Yes, I can't stay any longer." He bowed his head and whispered, "I know you have every right to decline what I'm about to ask, but—" She cut him short with a gentle hand on his chest. "I'll gladly go with you, my husband." Heath nodded when Leatrice looked at him. "You have not only my permission, but my blessing." Leatrice smiled, his eyes filled with thanks as he looked into Celia's bright blue eyes and stroked her blonde hair. Celia smiled up at him. "Still, there's one thing." "What?" "We'll have to get you a new body." She shook her head. "I don't think I can get used to that one." Leatrice nodded. "There's no worry. I've been Zack so long I know his form. Once we've left this land, I can change back." Celia made the 2 men stop and looked back to make sure no one could see them. "When you're in Zack's form, how much of you is Zack, and how much of you is before Zack?" He smiled. "Before I became Zack, I was an empty vessel, living only to exist, a painting done in black, white, and gray, without color. When I'm in Zack's form, I have his memories and emotions." He cupped her chin gently in his hand. "I could want nothing more than that for you." Chapter 5. Dharmar leaned back at the end of the table, waiting for our response. We were silent. Then Kalar spoke in his deep voice. It seems that even if evil passes itself off as good, time and events have a way of rooting it out and destroying it. How is one to know what the truth is in such events? Fristel asked. How could you tell good from evil? The doppelganger could have been guilty of the crimes just as Jan suggested. How can one ever tell? By listening to your heart, Ricardo replied. If you noticed, when Zack began telling his story, Celia and her father began to see the truth in his tale and the evil of Leatrice's actions. What if you have events that don't allow for the telling of such stories? Janya asked, or that require quick judgment? Perhaps one should always give both sides a chance to speak before taking action, Darmer said. Pay close attention to the details that each speaks. The innocent will say only that they are not guilty. The guilty, however, do not just claim innocence. They also say why they should be considered innocent and why the innocent one is the guilty party. So evil attempts to hide its guilt by making the innocent look as though they're truly the ones who committed a crime, regardless of what the facts show? I asked. Darmer nodded. The one who argues his innocent the most and says he has never done anything wrong is usually lying. We listened intently to his explanation. The innocent always have faith in others to discover the truth. The guilty or evil person has no faith, even in himself. So he must not only convince others of his innocence, but also of another's guilt. It should also be remembered, Darmir, Garth added, that it's wrong for us to have such preconceived thoughts of guilt or innocence based solely on what the type of person is under consideration. Jan thought the doppelganger was guilty for all the evil deeds committed, not because of proof, but because he was a doppelganger. I agree, Garth, I said. One must be careful not to judge others because they are different. Darmer smiled at our realization. Very good. I'm glad you have found the truth that ran through the story. Even though it provides information Ricard wanted about doppelgangers, it also proves that not all is as you may have heard. Yet in your story, Jan said, the doppelganger admitted that some of his race prey on humans. He seemed intent to defend his earlier statement, though it was clearly a losing battle. Would you call an entire race evil over the actions of a few? Darmer asked. If you do, what's your judgment on our race? Do we not have murderers as well as healers? We were silent, knowing he was right. As usual, Darmer's tales were entertaining, but they had a far more important quality of being educational. With much to think on, we decided to end the evening and begin surrounding ourselves with the many layers of insulating clothes we wore when we arrived. Once dressed, Fristel walked to Darmer and spoke quietly with him while the others left. I watched curiously as Fristel smiled when Darmer nudged him. Fristel jaunted out, and I heard him call Janya's name before the door closed by a sharp breeze. I walked to Darmer, who gave me a smiling, expectant look. What was that about? He laughed. He said he liked the story, but he thought Janya was a little embarrassed when I described the events with Celia at the beginning of the tale. I smiled at the thought of fair-haired Janya embarrassed by such a thing, when I knew she was not as innocent as she seemed. What did you say? Only the truth, he shrugged. It was not my intention to embarrass her, nor, I think, did she truly feel that way. Most women enjoy knowing that men notice them occasionally, especially those of her age. As for the rest, from your position, you could not see her occasional but intense study of Fristel, nor his of her. I furrowed my brow. Then I did not imagine it. He laughed so hard a tear came to his eye. Looking at my bewildered expression, he said the same thing as you. I muffled a laugh. That must have been when he nudged Fristel, causing him to leave. I nodded another good night and began to leave, but Darmer called to me just as I reached the door. Young sire, he said seriously, mark well what I may have said in jest. Always let the woman you love know how you feel about her. The time may come when you will not be able to do so, even though you would give anything to say it one last time. I heard the slightest tone of pain in his voice when he said that, and a chill of dread went down my spine. For some reason, it struck a deep chord in my soul. It was not until I had closed the door and stepped into the cold night air alone that I knew why. When I last saw Christine, and she told me of her trip with her parents, my last words were not of my love for her, but rather a selfish, jesting request not to have too much fun without me. I looked back at Darmer's home, the breeze cutting through me like an icy knife, thinking hard about what he had said. I shuddered not from the cold, but from the thought of how I would feel if those were the last words she had heard from me, or the last I would speak to her. I swore an oath to myself that night that I would never take someone's presence for granted again. I also swore, when I saw Christine again, I would make sure she knew how much I cared about her. Further, on my next visit, Darmer would know how much I appreciated his wisdom, which educated me in the ways of life.